The period is pi divided by your b value. So for the parent function, it's just pi. Multiples of pi. So you find the period exactly the same way as you do for tangent. It's pi divided by b. So for the parent function, it's pi. So the way you set up your inequality, or the way you're going to sketch the parent function, it's going to be from 0 to pi. You're going to start and end the cycle with asymptotes just like you do for tangent. So again, you're going to use your and inequality. If you have period and or phase shifts. So the way you set up your inequality for cotangent is going to start at 0. It's going to go from 0 to pi. Like I said, tangent is the only one that will not start at 0 when you set up the inequality. Tangent is your tricky one. Tangent's the one that'll go from negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. Yes?
What does and mean?
Compound and inequality. That's what this is. This is an and inequality. It's your bookend.
For cotangent, since it's the opposite of tan, why wouldn't you start at negative pi over 2?
Because cotangent of pi over 2 is 0. Because remember, tangent is y over x. Cotangent is x over y.
So this one's
So just like tangent, you're going to begin and end with asymptotes. And again, to find your phase shift, you still have to factor out the number in front of x. So like I said, guys, because the period of cotangent is pi, when you set up the inequality, it's going to go from 0 to pi, not 0 to 2 pi like sine, cosine, secant, and cosecant. Okay? Tangent is the only one that will not start at 0. All right, so let's take a look at some graphs. So let's talk about cotangent again. Just the parent function I know is going to go from 0 to pi. So let's just take a look at our parent function for cotangent. What's the midpoint between 0 and pi? Pi over 2. Midpoint between 0 and pi over 2? Pi over 4. And then the midpoint between pi over 2 and pi? 3 pi over 4. So like I said, you're going to start and end with vertical asymptotes. Now from your unit circle, what is the cotangent of pi over 4? Well, the tangent of pi over 4 is what? 1. So the cotangent of pi over 4 is 1. Because reciprocal of 1 is just 1. Pi over 2, I just mentioned this a few minutes ago. What's the cotangent of pi over 2? 0. Now we're moving into quadrant 2 on the unit circle. What's the cotangent of 3 pi over 4? Negative 1. So pi over 4, you're 1. Pi over 2 is 0. 3 pi over 4 is negative 1.
So max base.
Yep. So you go max, base, min. And you start and end with asymptotes. Yes, a cotangent looks a lot like a reflected tangent curve with a phase shift. All right? So remember, the domain is all real numbers except multiples of pi. 0 pi, 1 pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi, etc. The range is all real numbers. The period of this parent function is just pi. And remember, you have vertical asymptotes at the start and at the end. So So any questions about, so the biggest difference between the tangent and the cotangent, first of all, is where you're starting and ending. All right? And then the asymptotes are in different places. Okay? But you're always starting and ending with the asymptotes and the way you set up your inequality. So let's take a look at this example down here. What's the period for this cotangent? This period is what? Pi. Do you have a phase shift? No. Do we have a vertical translation? Yes. What are we going to do? We're going to go down one. So there is no phase shift. There is no period change. So I know the divisions along the x-axis are going to be just like it is for the parent function. Where's your baseline going to be? The baseline is going to be at -1. So I label my x-axis. Now my baseline's at -1. I do have an A value of 2, so that's my stretch. So I have to be 2 units above the baseline for the maximum, 2 units below the baseline for the minimum. Where are my asymptotes? X equals 0 and x equals pi. So where's the first point start for cotangent? Max, base, or min? Max. So I know at pi over 4 it's going to be 1. Then it's going to be a baseline. Then it's going to be a minimum. And I'm undefined at 0 and pi. So any questions on sketching a cotangent that has that stretch and the vertical translation?
Is there a number for, if it was a tan graph, would it be min A base?
Yeah. So any questions on that example? All right, let's look at another one. What's the period going to be for number 2? Pi over 2. Do I have a phase shift? Do I have a phase shift? No. Do I have a vertical translation? No. But what do I have? I have an A value equal to 3, and what else is happening in this equation? I'm going to have a what? Reflection. You treat a reflection just like you do for all the others. The min and maxes are going to flip-flop. So again, if you want to set up your bookend method, you can. 0 less than 2x less than pi. Divide by 2. 0 less than x less than pi over 2. So I know this is going to start at 0, end at pi over 2. So what's the midpoint between 0 and pi over 2? Pi over 4. What's the midpoint between 0 and pi over 4? Pi over 8. And then the midpoint between pi over 4 and pi over 2? 3 pi over 8. Where's my baseline? 0. Just the x-axis, exactly at 0. And again, my minimum is going to be 3 units above, 3 units below the baseline. Where are my asymptotes? 0 and pi over 2. Now it is a reflection. So where am I going to start at pi over 8? At 3 or -3? -3. Then I go to 0. Then I go at 3 pi over 4 to 3. So that is what a reflected cotangent curve is going to look like. A reflected cotangent looks like a tangent. So again, my asymptotes are at x equals 0, x equals pi over 2.
Was it 3 pi or 8?
3 pi over 8. Because when you add pi over 4 plus pi over 2, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, you're right. 3 pi over 8. Thank you. So any questions on graphing a reflected cotangent with a period change? Let's do one with a phase shift. Let's go to number 5. What's my period in number 5? Pi. Do I have a phase shift? Yes. I'm going to go where? Right, pi over 4. Do I have a vertical translation? No. What do I have happening, though? I have a reflection, and I have a stretch of what? 3. So again, I can use my bookend method, 0 less than x minus pi over 4 less than pi. Remember, for the inequality for cotangent, you're going 0 to pi. So how do I solve this inequality? I'm going to do what? Add pi over 4. What is pi plus pi over 4? 5 pi over 4. So the question is, what's the midpoint between pi over 4 and 5 pi over 4? 3 pi over 4. What's the midpoint between pi over 4 and 3 pi over 4? Pi over 2. And then the midpoint between 3 pi over 4 and 5 pi over 4? Pi. So again, I'm going to start labeling my x-axis at pi over 4. Remind me again where my asymptote's going to be. Pi over 4 and 5 pi over 4. Now be careful, it's a reflected cotangent with a stretch of 3. So my baseline is at 0 since there's no vertical shift. So at pi over 2, where's the point going to be? 3 or negative 3? Negative 3. Because it's a reflection. And then 3 pi over 4 will be 0. And then pi is going to be 3. And there's that curve. So my asymptotes are at x equals pi over 4, x equals 5 pi over 4. So any questions on number 5? Let's go down and let's do the last one, number 6. What's your period? In number 6, pi over 3. We'll come back to the vertical asymptotes. Phase shift. What do I have to factor out? I'm going to have to factor out a what? 3. So that's going to give me x plus what? Pi over 6. So what's my phase shift going to be? Left pi over 6. Do I have a vertical translation? Yes, I'm going to do what? Down 2. So any questions so far on the transformations? So now I've got to figure out where I'm going to start and end this cycle. So I'm going to set up my inequality. Remember, I'm going to go from 0. Just use my original 3x plus pi over 2 less than pi. So how do I solve this inequality? What's going to be my first step? Subtract pi over 2. So I have negative pi over 2 less than 3x. Listen, what is pi minus pi over 2? Pi over 2. Then what? Divide by 3. When I divide by 3, I'm actually going to do what? Multiply by 1/3. So I have negative pi over what? 6 less than x less than what? Pi over 6. So I know that this cycle is going to start at negative pi over 6, end at pi over 6.
Wait, pi minus pi over 2 is what?
Pi over 2. Are you talking about when I subtracted pi over 2 from pi? Yeah, it's just pi over 2. Because remember, pi is actually 2 pi over 2. So when you do pi minus pi over 2, remember that this is 2 pi over 2 minus pi over 2. What's the midpoint between negative pi over 6 and pi over 6? 0. Midpoint between negative pi over 6 and 0. And then the midpoint between 0 and pi over 6 will be pi over 12. So I can label my x-axis. Where are my asymptotes? Pi over 6 and negative pi over 6. Where's my baseline? Negative 2. My A value is what? Not my A value, but 1. So I'm going to be 1 unit above, 1 unit below. Now there is no reflection, so a cotangent is going to start where? At the max, base, or min? Max. So it's going to be at negative pi over 12, negative 1, 0, negative 2, pi over 12, negative 3. Remember, you always start and end with these asymptotes for tangent as well as cotangent. So any questions on that one there? So any questions on graphing the cotangent? All right, let's look at the very last question here, writing an equation. So they want me to write an equation in terms of cotangent that has a period of 3 pi, phase shift of 4 pi over 3 to the right, vertical compression by a factor of 2/3, and a reflection over the x-axis. So again, remember when I write the equation of cotangent, just like I did for sine and cosine, I got to know my A, B, C's, and D's. So you got to find your A, B, C's, and D's and plug them in. What's the A value here going to be since they're telling you you have a vertical compression?
1. Oh.
A is going to be negative 2/3 because you have a reflection. So that takes care of the compression and the reflection. What's your B value going to be? So it's going to be pi over what? The period is 3 pi. So then what's your B value going to be? B will be equal to 1/3. C. So you have a phase shift 4 pi over 3 to the right. So what's your C value going to be? 4 pi over 3. And again, I know in my equation it's going to keep the minus. Do I have everything? They're not telling me I have a vertical shift, do they? So now I'm just going to fill in my A, B, and C. So y is equal to negative 2/3 times the cotangent of 1/3 times x minus 4 pi over 3. So there's your equation. Remember, you find your A, B, C's, and D's when you're writing the equations. Okay? So questions on that? You survived.